There's a reason why Leon County is known as the dearest place in Texas. We are blessed with an abundance of white-tailed deer. But not only white-tailed deer, we have a wide variety of wildlife that live and reside in Leon County. For some, they enjoy seeing the wildlife. For others, maybe not so much because they are eating their garden, they're eating their landscape plants. But regardless, wildlife live in Leon County because we have great habitat, food, and water sources for them. So if you're a homeowner that would like to attract more wildlife to your property, maybe Wildscape Gardening is something that you're interested in. Hello, I'm Richard Parrish. I'm the County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Leon County, and that's what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes is Wildscape Gardening. Well, what is Wildscape Gardening? It's probably not a term that a lot of people are familiar with. Wildscape gardening is an idea of producing a well-balanced habitat which invites native wildlife into our backyards, native wildlife being the key. And in order to bring in those native wildlife species, we want to make sure that we use native species of plants. When providing habitat for wildlife, we must keep an ecosystem frame of mind, realizing that these animals, these deer, these birds, these possums, these raccoons, these squirrels, simply do what they do. They don't necessarily intend to harm your vegetation or your landscape plants, but they do what they do in order to survive and in order to reproduce. So we must remember that this wildlife is part of the ecosystem. They're part of the world around us. So why is wildscape gardening necessary? Well, when we think about land in Texas, the majority of Texas land is managed or owned by private landowners. And these landowners, they take their little bit of heaven and they modify it to fit their needs, their wants, their desires. And as they modify the habitat on the land that they manage, that habitat changes. And as the habitat changes, so will the wildlife populations that depend upon those habitats. So whether as a land manager, whether you have an apartment balcony or a 20-acre farm or a 2,000-acre ranch, you can create habitat that attract wildlife and help to restore that habitat in commercial and residential areas. So there are some steps that you can go about to help create a wildlife-friendly garden. And when we think about creating a wildlife-friendly garden, we want to think about what is it? What are the requirements that wildlife need in order to live? Well, one of those basic requirements is food. So by providing food for wildlife, we're on our way to creating a wildlife-friendly garden. In addition to food, wildlife also needs water. They need water in order to live, and then they also need cover or habitat in order to raise their young, in order to hide from predators. So by creating a wildlife-friendly garden, you are going to be providing food, water, and cover for wildlife. Well, let's think about providing food for wildlife. Wildlife has been in Leon County for eons, and so they have grown up and adapted to feeding on the native plants that are here. So using native plants in a wildlife garden is very important. Those native plants provide foliage, they provide nectar, pollen, berries, seeds, and nuts that those wildlife species have come to depend on in order to live and to grow and to raise their young. Native plants are also well adapted to survive in a particular geographic area. So those native plants have become accustomed to our climate. They've become accustomed to the amount of rainfall that we get. They've become accustomed to our hot summers and our fairly mild winters. So those native plants, not only have the wildlife come to depend on them, but those native plants are very well adapted to our geographic area with our climate and our soil conditions. Also, these native plants usually require very little maintenance because they have become so adapted to our climate and to our geographic region. And also these native plants, they serve an important role in our ecosystem. Being native, being here for so long, they have become a part of the local ecosystem. So if you remove those native plants from the local ecosystem, you begin to throw that local ecosystem off balance. So those native plants are vitally important in providing food for wildlife. Now, as we think about providing food for wildlife, there's a variety of wildlife we need to keep in mind, whether it be birds or insects or even mammal species. So when we provide food for wildlife, let's think about birds for an example. One of the things that a lot of people will provide is by hanging up a bird feeder and filling it with bird seed. So, we think about feeders, so that, we've got bird feeders, there's hummingbird feeders, there's squirrel feeders, even butterfly feeders. A lot of people don't think about butterfly feeders, but we can certainly encourage butterflies by putting up some butterfly feeders as well. All of these are ways to help provide food for wildlife. So let's think about birds. Let's shift gears and think about birds. So bird feeding 101. When we're feeding birds, we want to make sure that we provide many feeding stations. Don't just have one feeding station, set out several feeding stations. And some species of birds, they might be a little territorial, and they might try to run off other birds because they think that this feeding station is theirs. So provide multiple feeding stations. Also, by providing multiple feeding stations, you're going to be encouraging a larger population of birds to come into your garden habitat. You want to make sure that you clean those feeders regularly. You want to clean them so that mold or mildew doesn't accumulate in those feeders, which can create toxins which can actually cause our bird populations to become sick. So make sure you clean those feeders on a regular basis. Keep the seed clean and dry. We want to keep the seed dry, especially because wet seed can either mold, which can produce toxins, which can make birds sick. Wet seed can also start to germinate, and we don't want to be growing plants within our bird feeder. So keep the seed that you're feeding your birds clean and dry. Also, make sure that you use a seed blend designed for the feeder type that you're using. And make sure that you're using a seed blend that's designed or developed for the type of birds you're wanting to feed. Some birds like oil seeds, such as sunflower. Other birds like seeds such as maybe millet. So do a little research into the type of birds you're wanting to attract. Do a little research into what type of seed those birds eat, and put that type of seed in the feeder that you've got in your garden or in your Wildscape garden. Also, whenever you place your bird feeders, make sure that you place those bird feeders in a location that isn't anywhere close to where cats or other predators might be hanging around so that they can actually feed on the birds. So make your bird feeder a true bird feeder for birds. Don't make your bird feeder a cat feeder instead. A little bit more about feeding birds. In addition to those feeders, plant native plants to provide food that those birds might not be able to get from a feeder. So, do they eat fruits? If they eat certain types of fruits, maybe plant a certain type of fruit tree in your habitat to attract those birds. They're not going to get all of their food from the bird feeders. So plant some of those plants that will provide that nutrition source, that food source that they're not getting from the feeder. I mentioned sunflower seeds a little bit ago. The black oil sunflower seed is a favorite food source for most every seed-eating species of birds. And even suets. Suets are basically a high-fat food source. So suet feeders are a favorite of woodpeckers and other insect-eating birds. A problem or a word of caution when using a suet feeder for a bird is don't put the suet out in warm weather, because the oils in that suet will start to heat up and it will go rancid. And once it goes rancid, not only does it create a foul smell for us as the landowner or the land manager to deal with, but once it goes rancid, a lot of birds will not feed on that rancid suet. So make sure that if you're using a suet feeder, that you use it in a cooler time of year. July, August, probably not the best time to be using a suet feeder. Now, whenever you put your bird feeders out and the birds become accustomed to feeding on those feeders, make sure that you keep them filled, because once you get your birds habitated to that bird feeder, you get them used to coming in, you've got to keep it filled or else they're going to be looking for other food sources. So keep your bird feeders filled. Hummingbirds are another bird species that are attracted to Leon County. We'll see a flush of hummingbirds in the spring as they work on their migration, and then again we'll see another flush of hummingbirds in the fall as they continue on their migration. So one of the things you can do to attract hummingbirds is to actually plant a hummingbird garden. Hummingbirds go for red and orange and purple tube-shaped flowers with lots of nectar. So if you're planting plants in your garden to attract hummingbirds, look for those plants that have long tube-shaped flowers in colors of red or orange or purple. If you're going to be planting, or if you're going to be hanging a hummingbird feeder, you can certainly do that as well. And you don't necessarily have to go out and buy the high-dollar hummingbird food when you can make your own. You can dissolve 1 part white sugar in 4 parts of hot water, or 1 cup of sugar to 4 cups of hot water or boiling water. Dissolve that, let it cool before putting it in your bird feeder and into your hummingbird feeder. So boil the water if you plan to store it in the refrigerator. If you don't have time, if your hummingbird feeder is empty and you're in a pinch, you can mix the 4 parts hot water to 1 part sugar. Maybe not necessarily boil it, just use a warm water, dissolve that sugar in the water and put it straight into your bird feeder. But if you do use boiling water, make sure that you let it cool before you put it in your hummingbird feeder. Never use honey when you're making your hummingbird nectar, because honey can ferment easily. And also some other things to avoid with hummingbird nectar is artificial sweeteners or red food coloring. Yes, the hummingbirds are attracted to the color red, but avoid using red food coloring. As long as you've got red on your hummingbird feeder, that will attract the hummingbirds. The color of the nectar is not going to attract the hummingbirds. So just no red food coloring in the nectar. Just make sure that you have red on your hummingbird feeder. And as I've said, let that solution cool to room temperature before putting it in your feeder. You put that hot hummingbird nectar in your feeder, you put it out, the hummingbirds come to it, they ingest that hot liquid that can cause them to become sick or even die because of the hot nectar. So make sure that nectar does cool to room temperature before you put out that hummingbird nectar in your feeder. For some, they want to attract butterflies to their garden. Butterflies have a lot of benefits. Butterflies, they're pretty to watch. Just watching a butterfly flitter around the garden, it's relaxing. It's fun to watch. It's nice to watch. They're pretty to watch. Butterflies also serve as a pollinator. They're not a primary pollinator. We've got a lot of native species of bees that will do that, but butterflies do their fair share in helping to pollinate our flowers and plants. So, butterflies do provide some benefit to our garden. So, if we're trying to attract butterflies, it's necessary to incorporate plants that serve the needs of all the life stages. And when we're thinking about butterflies, our butterflies are going to lay eggs. Those eggs are going to hatch and they're going to turn into caterpillars. And then those caterpillars are going to turn into chrysalids, which they turn into the cocoons, and then they'll hatch out into butterflies and start the whole cycle again. So if you're planting plants for butterflies, make sure that you plant plants for caterpillars as well, because the primary food source for those caterpillars is plants. So make sure that you plant some of the plant species for the particular butterfly species you're trying to attract, and realize that those caterpillars are going to eat those plants. So make sure that it's okay if you're planting your butterfly garden. Make sure that you're aware that those caterpillars are going to eat on those plants. So whenever you start seeing foliage being the plants being defoliated because of the caterpillars, you're expecting that because you're feeding those baby caterpillars. because those caterpillars are going to turn into the butterflies. So when we're putting together our butterfly garden, there's a few necessities or a few things that we want to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we plant native flowering plants. Those native flowering plants have co-evolved with our butterfly species, so they're dependent upon one another. The butterflies are dependent upon, and the butterflies and the caterpillars are dependent upon those native flowering plants for food, and then those native flowering plants are dependent upon our butterflies for pollination. So make sure that we're using those native flowering plants. As an example, monarchs will migrate through, and monarchs primarily feed on milkweed. Well, the native species of milkweed is the best to plant for monarchs because they bloom at the time when the monarchs are coming through. If you go to a garden center, you can buy some of the tropical milkweeds and plant in your landscape. The problem with the tropical milkweed is that they bloom later in the year. So as the monarchs come through and they feed on the tropical milkweed, rather than feeding on the milkweed and continuing their migration, because it's blooming later, they hang around. And as a result, they're still here whenever our winters hit in Leon County. And so our tropical milkweed, while the monarchs will feed on it, it actually causes more harm than good for the monarchs, because if we lose our monarch population because they're here in Texas during the winter, well, that's monarch butterflies that we don't have to populate in the future. So make sure that you do use those native flowering plants. Also, you want to make sure that you plant the type and color plant that the adults or that the butterflies are attracted to. Adult butterflies are attracted to reds and yellows and orange and pink and purple blossoms that are flat-topped or clusters and have short flower tubes. So whereas with the hummingbirds we're looking for long tubes, butterflies like more of the short flower tubes in the red, yellow, orange, pink, and purple colors. So make sure that you plant the right colors that butterflies are attracted to. And also make sure that you plant those good nectar sources in the sun. Generally, adult butterflies will only feed in the sun. So if you're planting a butterfly garden, put it in the sun. Don't plant it in the shade, because if it's in the shade, you're probably not going to have butterflies feeding in your garden. A few other butterfly garden necessities: plant for continuous bloom. Plant a variety of species so that whenever one species stops blooming, another begins. That way you can keep those native butterfly species in your garden the whole season long. If you plant just one type of flower or one type of plant, once that plant stops blooming, those butterflies are going to go somewhere else. So plant for continuous bloom by planting multiple species. So try and keep your garden in bloom all season long. Also, if you're planting a butterfly garden, avoid the insecticides. Remember, butterflies are insects. Insecticides kill insects, so insecticides will kill the butterflies. And as I've mentioned earlier, those butterflies at one point in their life started off as caterpillars. So you want to make sure that you feed the butterfly caterpillars. If you don't grow the caterpillars, there will be no adult butterflies. So if you're going to have caterpillars, be prepared for those caterpillars to feed on the foliage of those plants. So going back to the point from before, no to insecticides. If we kill the butterflies, we kill the insects. If we kill the caterpillars, we kill the butterflies. So feed those butterfly caterpillars, but say no to insecticides. Also, in our butterfly garden, we want to provide a place for those butterflies to rest. So we might set some flat stones in our garden so that we've got a place for those butterflies to rest and to bask in the sun. Give them a place to rest. Also, give them a place for puddling. Now, for butterflies, puddling is a way that in which they might cool off or get water. So by puddling, they're drinking water and extracting minerals from damp puddles. So what you might do in order to encourage puddling is to maybe place some coarse sand in a shallow pan or in the bottom of a little flower pot tray. And then insert that pan somewhere into your habitat. You want to make sure that you keep that sand moist throughout the season so that those butterflies have a source to puddle. So we've talked about butterflies, we've talked about birds and hummingbirds, but we might want to attract other wildlife into our garden, and we're going back to that idea of native plants. So we've talked some about the benefits of native plants. They're well adapted to survive in a particular geographic area. They usually require less maintenance, and they're welcomed by wildlife. And you want to make sure by using those native plants, make sure that you provide a diversity. Don't just have one type of plant, have a variety of native plant species in your garden, because you're providing multiple food sources, you're providing plant species that might bloom at various times throughout the year. Make sure that you provide diversity within those native plants. Now, you want to use some caution when using non-native plant species in your wildscape garden. First off, you want to be careful because those non-native species can become an invasive species. And if they do become an invasive species, they can outcompete some of the native species, overtaking and thus changing, altering the habitat, not necessarily for the betterment of wildlife. So it's important to make sure in your wildscape garden, use the native species. Try and avoid those non-native plant species. Well, maybe you're starting off fresh and you don't have any wildflowers or any native grasses in your landscape. Well, what do? Well, of course, you can go out and buy seed, but you want to plant seed at certain times of the year. And maybe when you're out working in your wildscape garden, that's not necessarily the time of year to be planting. So you might consider making seed balls. These seed balls, while it might look like some sort of a kid's chocolate cereal or something, these seed balls are actually soil that have native plant seed, whether it be grass or wildflower seeds, embedded in them. So these seed balls are about a 1/2 inch in diameter, and they're models of the living world. They contain native seed that will complete the habitat that you're trying to develop for wildlife. These seed balls are easy to make and they're easy to apply. Basically, once you get these seed balls made and they're dried, you can simply go out there and either you or go out with your grandkids or your kids and sling them out in your field, sling them out in your garden area. And that's how you apply the seeds, or that's how you plant the seeds. And then over time, through weathering, as it rains and that rain action starts to work on these seed balls, the seeds that are included in these seed balls are released. And so this is a slow release seed application. Well, how does one go about making seed balls? This might be something, an activity you can do with your kids or grandkids. How do I go about making seed balls? It's a pretty simple process. It takes 1 part of dry humus, 2 to 3 parts of dry native seed mix, 5 parts of dry red clay, and 1 to 2 parts of fine dry sand. You mix all of those dry ingredients together, and then you add 1 to 2 parts water. Once you get that mixture mixed, you'll pinch off a little bit and you'll roll it into balls, and you'll allow those balls to dry thoroughly before you distribute. And how do we distribute those seed balls? As I've already said, by casting them out or by throwing them out into your wildscape garden or into your habitat. That's how you make the seed balls. So we've talked about food, food being a very important thing for wildlife, but we also want to make sure that we provide water for wildlife. Water is one of those basic requirements for life. So the importance of water, the animals will drink from the water. We might not think of it, but animals will also bathe. As humans, we bathe on a fairly regular basis, but we don't necessarily think of wildlife taking a bath. But bathing is something that wildlife do, and water is important for that. And also, water is important for wildlife for the process of reproduction. The water is vitally important for life, and in order to continue that life, reproduction is certainly a part of that. So water is important for reproduction within our wildlife species. So, the variety of sources of water. There are natural features such as rivers and lakes and streams, maybe some springs, maybe some creeks. But then there's also man-made features such as this water trough that this fox is drinking out of. So there are some man-made water features that you can use as well. So when we're thinking about water sources for wildlife, probably one of the first ones that comes to mind is a bird bath. Bird baths are an easy way to provide clean water for birds, even for insects, and in some cases, bird baths even provide water for some of our smaller mammal species. You want to make sure that you change the water 2 to 3 times per week, especially during warm weather. You want to make sure that you keep the water in that bird bath because with our hot Texas summers, that water can evaporate. So make sure that you provide water at least 2 to 3 times a week. So make sure that you keep that bird bath filled, especially in the summertime. And I would say, I would go more than just make sure you're keeping it filled. I would change the water 2 to 3 times a week because our mosquito species will lay their eggs in standing water. So by changing that water 2 to 3 times per week, we're going to keep our mosquito populations down because as we dump the water that's in that bird bath, we're eliminating any mosquito eggs or mosquito larvae that might be in there. So it's a way to help keep our mosquito populations down as well. So as we build a backyard pond, that's an opportunity to provide a water source for wildlife, whether it be birds or insects or maybe even maybe you want fish, having a fish pond. So a backyard pond is certainly a great way to provide a water source for wildlife. So as you build that backyard pond, use a flexible liner, and because you can manipulate that flexible liner to fit your landscape, to fit the shape and the depth and the design that you want to fit in your landscape for your pond. So use a flexible liner. Include rocks or logs in your pond to allow critters a chance to get in and out of that pond easy, whether it might be frogs or salamanders and maybe even the occasional snake. So provide those rocks and logs in the pond so animals can get in and out easily. And you want to make sure that you position that pond where it will receive some direct sun. Now you don't want that pond to be in direct sun and full sun all the time. It's okay for it to be in shade, but you do want it to take in some full sun so that water can actually heat up. But like I said, that shade will also help that water cool down. So that full sun will allow some species of wildlife to be attracted to it, but you don't want that pond in full sun at all times. As you care for your pond, you might design your pond so that you install some pumps for movement of the water. You might install some waterfalls or some fountains. All of these are ways to keep the water moving. By keeping that water moving, you're keeping oxygen in that pond, and especially if you're putting fish in the pond, that moving water will help keep that oxygen that those fish need in order to live. You also keep in mind the depth of the pond. We want to make sure that if you're putting in a backyard pond, you want it deep enough so that it not to freeze during the Texas winter. Now I realize our winters are very different. Sometimes some years might be colder than the next. So you want to make sure that you plant or that you install your pond deep enough so that it's not going to freeze in the winter, because if that pond freezes over and there are birds that have hung around in the winter, or if there are mammal species that are dependent upon that pond for water and that pond freezes over, they're not going to have that water source. So make sure that you put your pond deep enough so that it's not going to freeze in the winter time. Also consider your water source. If the water is being treated with chlorine, consider using some sort of dechlorinator to take that chlorine out of the water. You might even think about using rainwater, harvested rainwater, as a water source for your backyard water garden or your water feature. Also, keep the algae in check. On a regular basis, monitor the algae, and if you need to, remove that algae either by cleaning the pond by hand or using some sort of algicide in order to remove that algae. And as always, think safety. Keep an eye on the kids if you've got kids in your backyard that are going to be around the pond, around that water feature, because all it takes is turning a back, and a young kid can fall into the pond and drown if you're not careful. So please keep safety in mind when designing that water feature in your wildscape garden, and keep an eye on the kids if the kids are around the pond. Well, we don't think a lot about creating habitat for frogs and toads and other amphibians, but they need a place to live also. Well, you can certainly go all out and create them a toad abode by finding some fancy hotel for them either online or at one of the local box stores or garden centers, but it doesn't have to be so fancy. You can take an old busted flower pot and create a toad abode in that way, just a place for them to receive some shelter from the sun, a little bit, an area that's cool and shaded. So this old flower pot has certainly has the same benefit as the fancy toad abode that we see here. So a busted clay pot will work well. Here this is a great project for kids. They've created a little bitty water source, and they've taken a clay flower pot and they've propped it up with rocks to create a toad abode. So creating that cool, moist, shaded area for frogs, toads, and other amphibians will certainly attract them to your wildscape garden. And those frogs, toads, and amphibians do play a vital role in your wildscape garden ecosystem. So, I mentioned rainwater a while ago, as a possible water source. Rainwater harvesting is a great way to provide water for wildlife. So if you have an opportunity or if you have a method to collect rainwater, I would certainly encourage you to do so, to provide that natural water, that unchlorinated water for your wildlife. So we've talked about food, we've talked about water. The third thing that is of vital importance for wildlife is shelter or cover. So, wildlife in our habitats, in our gardens, they need places to hide and to feel safe. So a lot of places that wildlife will hide so that they can feel safe would include native vegetation, shrubs, brush piles, dead trees, rock piles, or even birdhouses. All of these are places where wildlife will seek cover to hide and to feel safe. So when you're thinking about where you're going to provide this cover, a few things to keep in mind. Whenever we think about native vegetation or shrubs, first thing that might come to mind is a tree. So planting a tree is a great way to provide cover for wildlife. Planting a tree is a great way to provide habitat in your wildscape garden. So when you're selecting a tree, think about your soil type. What type of soil do you have? Here in Leon County, we've got primarily a sandy type of soil. Also, as you're thinking about your tree, where you're going to plant it, are you planting it in a sunny area or are you planting it in a shady area? You might want to try probably planting your tree in full sun. But depending upon the variety of the tree, you might need to plant it closer to a shady spot. How much moisture is in your soil? What's the moisture level of your soil? And also think about if I've got a tree that requires a large amount of water, am I going to want to haul water to where that tree, where I'm planting that tree? So think about the moisture level of the soil. Also think about overhead or underground obstacles. You don't want to plant a tree underneath or close to an overhead power line. Also know where underground lines, whether it be electric lines or plumbing lines, are in the ground, so that as you plant your tree, you are avoiding those overhead and underground obstacles. Also, whenever you're selecting your site to plant the tree, be aware of how close the tree is to surrounding buildings. How big is that tree going to get? And in the future, where is the site you're looking at, is that going to create problems with the existing structures? So those are some things to consider when trying to select a site to plant your tree. Once you've selected your site, go about picking your tree. What type of tree are you wanting to include in your habitat? As I've mentioned before, those native species of trees are what we really want to include. Now, there are some non-native species that have become adapted species that are certainly okay to plant in your wildscape, but if at all possible, plant a native tree species. And when you go to buy that tree, look for a good quality tree. Look for a tree that is strong and sturdy, has good healthy leaves. You don't want to buy a tree where the leaves are looking sickly or it looks wilted. Buy a good quality tree, and you want a tree with a straight central leader. Have that tree stand up straight and tall. And you also want to look for strong shoot development with large buds and leaves on the tree. And if you can, I know some trees are in pots, some are maybe wrapped in burlap. If you can, look at the roots before you buy the tree. And I realize that's not always possible, but if you can look at the roots, you want good white roots that are ready for transplant. If you are able to look at the roots and you see brown roots, leave that tree alone. That's not a good healthy tree. You want good white roots from your transplant. And also you want to make sure that you have a good branching structure within your tree that you're looking at buying. So you've identified your site, you've picked out the tree you want, now you're ready to plant the tree. So to plant the tree, you want to dig a shallow hole, and then you're going to plant the tree. Typically you want to dig the hole about twice the size of the root ball. That way you can provide some good loose soil for those roots to go out and start to grow. Whenever you plant that tree, it's not a bad idea to actually disturb those roots just a little bit, just to encourage them to grow out. Because especially if they've been growing in a pot, those roots are used to growing in a circular motion. So by disturbing those roots, they're going to be growing out, and that's going to encourage strong root development within that tree. It's always a good idea to stake the tree, especially if it's a taller tree. By staking that tree, you're preventing the wind or something else from toppling that tree over until those roots get established and get developed and allow that tree to really grasp firm into the soil it's planted in. Mulch around new trees. By mulching around new trees, you're helping to keep that moisture into the soil, into the root zone, where those roots are going to pick up moisture. So mulch around new trees, and then also make sure that you do any follow-up care that you might need. That follow-up care might be keeping weeds away from the trees, maybe loosening or removing the stakes once the tree gets established and gets some size to it. It might even include maybe even pruning the tree at a later date, but do any follow-up care that you need to after that tree is planted. So trees are a great way to provide cover, habitat, food in your wildscape garden. But a live tree is not the only way to attract wildlife. A lot of wildlife can be attracted with dead trees. So with a dead tree, it's a snag. A snag is a name for dead trees that are left upright to decompose naturally. Snags can provide great habitat, can provide great cover in a wildscape garden. It can also provide an interesting architectural feature in your wildscape garden. So snags are those dead trees that are left upright to decompose naturally. A word of caution about snags, though: if those snags are going to provide a safety hazard, for if that snag was to fall, would it damage property or would it injure someone? So keep that in mind whenever you're considering a snag in your wildscape garden. And then also logs. When those snags or part of a snag falls on the ground, it then becomes a log. So those snags and logs are great ways to attract certain species of wildlife. So dead trees, even dead trees, can provide a valuable resource in your wildscape garden. So how do they provide that valuable resource in a wildscape garden? Well, dead trees help wildlife by providing them a place to live. There are certain bird species that will only live in dead trees. And so they'll carve out the cavity, or they'll carve out their nesting habitat, and it will give them a place to raise their young. These dead trees, these snags, these logs also provide a food source for certain wildlife species. as these snags and logs decompose, insects will be feeding and decomposing these trees. Well, birds and certain mammal species will feed on the insects that are breaking down these snags and logs. So these snags and logs provide a food source for wildlife species. It provides a crow's nest, especially for some bird species. They like that crow's nest or that high vantage point where they can look across the habitat to help them find their next meal. So those snags especially provide a crow's nest for wildlife to utilize. It also provides a hiding place, maybe to hide from either the heat of the day or from predators. And also, as these snags and logs break down, it provides a soil refresher. It helps to release nutrients and other organic matter into the soil. So it helps keep our soil nourished and refreshed. And so it's part of that circle of life, a part of that ecosystem. So our snags and logs provide a lot of benefit to our wildlife as well as our ecosystem as a whole. So, as we incorporate dead trees into our habitat, I mentioned that we want to make sure that if we do have some snags in our habitat, that they're safe, that they're not going to create any damage to property or damage to people or individuals. So never allow dead wood to rest against your home. Not only can that dead wood resting against your home damage your home, that dead wood can attract termites. And if that dead wood is resting against your home, the termites could certainly make their way over to your home. So never allow that dead wood to rest against your home. And you want to remove any dead trees that could fall on your home or even your neighbor's home, or if it's going to fall on a property line, depending upon what type of relationship you have with your neighbor. Remove any of those dead trees that can fall on your home, your neighbor's home, or onto your neighbor's fence for that matter. And you might consider moving that snag or that wood to another area in your yard or into your wildscape habitat that is safe. So just because you remove a snag doesn't mean that snag is now going to be a log or you're going to have to totally remove it from your wildscape garden. You can remove that snag to another part of your wildscape garden that would be safer in case something were to happen with that snag. So, I mentioned termites, so you want to make sure that you do keep those snags a reasonable distance away from those structures, just so you're not infesting your home, your storage sheds, other buildings and structures with termites. As we continue talking about, incorporating those dead trees into your habitat, maybe you don't have snags, maybe you don't have large dead trees. Well, you can certainly create artificial snags. Maybe you can trim branches on live trees of varying size and maybe put those up in the corner of your landscape. Or maybe by just creating a nesting box. A nesting box is considered a type of artificial snag. So if you are incorporating nesting boxes, you want to make sure that you incorporate those nesting boxes in the proper habitat and at the proper height for the bird species that you are trying to attract. How many snags do you need in your habitat? Well, a good rule of thumb is to try and have about 3 snags per acre. Now, I realize in some wildscape gardens, it's not going to be an acre. It's going to be just a backyard. But if you've got the room, 3 snags per acre is a pretty good rule of thumb. So in addition to snags, wildlife like brush shelters. Those brush shelters provide dense, heavy, and secure shelter close to the ground. Not all wildlife species want to scurry up a tree or live in a tree. Some of them like to live close to the ground, and that's what these brush shelters provide. So you can build a sturdy structure out of logs and branches that will provide shelter while still allowing space for the animals to move around. It might be just a brush pile. That brush pile might actually have some thought put into it so that there is some open areas for animals to come in and escape from. You want to make sure that at least half of the shelter, half of that brush pile receives direct sunlight. Some species of wildlife, they need that in order to help regulate their body temperature. So make sure that at least half of the brush pile receives direct sunlight. You can also create some artificial nesting structures. Yes, a brush pile, I guess, could be considered an artificial nesting structure. We've talked some already about toad abodes. A birdhouse is considered an artificial nesting structure. A bat house. We don't think about bats, but bats are certainly a type of wildlife, and we need to encourage our bat populations. Our bat populations help to keep down our insect numbers, so bats are certainly something to consider whenever you are designing your wildscape garden. Have some habitat for bats. And then also bee houses. Now, when I say a bee house, I'm not necessarily meaning a hive, but just like on this picture on the side of the screen here, this is a bee house that's used for some of our native masonry or solitary bees. It's a block of non-treated wood with holes drilled in it. The bees will make their way in there. They will lay their eggs, and this is a way that we can help to provide an artificial nesting structure for some of our native bee species. When we're talking about nesting boxes, we want to make sure that the box is constructed of natural, untreated wood. We want to make sure that the thickness of the lumber is at least 3/4 of an inch thick in order to provide insulation from the weather. And you want to make sure that the entrance hole is of the appropriate size to allow the desired species to enter. So for birdhouses, for example, you want to make sure that the entrance hole is of the right size so that the species you're trying to attract can get in, but that it keeps larger birds out. Also, especially with birdhouses, you want to make sure that the entrance is the correct distance from the floor of the birdhouse so that it can accommodate the bird's nest. You want to make sure that it has an extended and a sloped roof to keep the rain out. Just like we go into our houses to get out of the elements, wildlife, these birds go into their birdhouses in order to get out of the rain. So we want to make sure that that sloped roof keeps the rain out. You want it extended a little bit, especially such that if it was to rain, that water, or not so much water, can get in through the entrance hole. So the extended roof will help to keep that water out of the entrance hole. Make sure that it has a recessed floor and drainage holes to keep the interior dry. Try as we might, there is going to be some water and some moisture that's going to make it into this nesting box. So by putting some holes in the floor, that's going to allow that water to dry out. It's going to allow airflow in through that nesting box, which will also help with keeping the box dry. Also, if possible, use a rough or grooved interior wall. As those fledglings, as those young birds begin to leave the nest, that rough or grooved interior will help them to actually exit the nest, exit the nesting box, gives them something to crawl up on. And as I've mentioned, ventilation holes. Those ventilation holes, not only do they help keep the nesting box dry, it also helps to regulate the temperature within that nesting box. So make sure that you have those ventilation holes to allow the interior of the nesting box to remain cool. Make sure that your box has a side or top panel that allows it to be opened easily. That way you can maybe go in there and at the end of the season clean out that box. Or it allows you a way to monitor, to know if you've got birds or other wildlife using those nesting boxes. So make sure it's got an easy door that allows for cleaning and monitoring. Make sure that your nesting box has no outside perches, because those outside perches actually allow, it's a way that predators can get into your nesting box, and it's a way that other harassing birds can get in and maybe even evict the bird species that you have in the nesting box. So avoid nesting boxes with outside perches. Make sure that that nesting box is at the proper height for the intended species, and make sure that it's in the correct habitat for those intended species that you're trying to attract as well. Well, where do you want to place your nesting box? Make sure that your birdhouse or your nesting box is in a location where the target species is likely to reside. So if you're trying to attract a species of wildlife that likes a lot of brush cover, you're probably going to want to put it along a tree line or in a heavily wooded area. If you're trying to attract a species that you're going to see maybe along a transition area between maybe a field and a tree line, put along in that area where where you know that species is going to be attracted to. Try to avoid putting your birdhouses and your nesting boxes in areas where herbicides or pesticides are going to be used. You can either mount that nesting box on a pole or on a tree, making sure that it's at the proper height that it needs to be. And you also want to make sure or take into consideration the direction that your nesting box is facing. And with your nesting box, you want to make sure that they are in place, cleaned out, and ready to go no later than February. Once February gets here, your nesting box should be in place, and it should be good for the rest of the season. If it's past February, you're already too late. So you put your nesting box out past February, you may or you may not have wildlife traffic coming to your nesting box. So you do want to make sure that you monitor and keep your nesting box clean. So once that season begins, monitor for activity. Now that doesn't mean to go and actually raise your doors to see if there's wildlife living in there, but keep an eye on it. Do you see birds flying in and out of the entrance hole? That's a way you can monitor for activity. And as you're monitoring, is the birds using, or the wildlife species using that nesting box? Is it the species you wanted? Or is the house being used by an invasive bird species, or maybe a species you're not wanting? And if that's the case, if it's being used by an invasive bird species, remove the nest. Remove the nest and make them. That way, those birds are going to go somewhere else, and you can attract the native species or the bird species that you're looking to attract. Once the eggs have been laid, monitor the progress of the nest. How long is it going to take those eggs to hatch? Once those eggs hatch, how long do those young stay in the nest before they leave? Do a little bit of research on the species you're attracting. Monitor and know when your birds should have left the nest. And once those young have fledged out and the house is no longer in use, clean it out. Clean it out and get it ready for the next season or for another cycle of birds coming in. Wildscape gardening, while we're attracting wildlife, whether it be birds or mammals or reptiles, even snakes, that's something that we didn't talk about, but snakes are a type of wildlife as well, so you might even attract snakes to your wildscape gardening. The thing to keep in mind or to remember is that wildscape gardening does not provide a license to ignore any local or county laws, any homeowner agreements, or other covenants. Please respect the local guidelines, the local laws that govern the community that you live in. So, in summary, as we're talking about wildscape gardening, we want to make sure that we provide food for wildlife. We want to make sure we do that by planting and providing native plants. Make sure that we supply water for wildlife, whether it be through a natural or a man-made artificial water source. And we want to make sure that we provide adequate cover for wildlife. That adequate cover provides shelter and safety for wildlife. That could be through trees, that can be through snags or logs, that can be through brush pile. That cover might be an artificial nesting box, but we want to make sure we provide that cover for wildlife. So by providing food, water, and cover for wildlife, you're well on your way to creating a wildscape garden. Now, if you're interested in creating a wildscape garden, there are several resources that are available to help get you pointed in the right direction. The Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service has developed a publication on woody plants and wildlife. So it provides a long listing of woody plant species, whether they're native or not, and it will tell you what type of wildlife species are attracted to them. So by doing a search for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Woody Plants and Wildlife, you should be able to find this resource. If not, contact your local county extension office and they should be able to provide this resource for you. While it's an older publication, Kelly Conrad Bender, who at one point worked for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, wrote a book entitled Texas Wildscapes, Gardening for Wildlife. And it provides a wealth of resources in regards to plants to plant for wildlife, designing a landscape for wildlife. So Texas Wildscapes, Gardening for Wildlife by Kelly Conrad Bender is an excellent book on the topic of wildscape gardening. And then, of course, too, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has a section on their website that deals with wildscape gardening. It talks about several native plant species to consider in your garden. It talks about some design tips. So a great resource is on the Texas Texas Parks and Wildlife Department website. Just type in on their search feature Wildscapes, and it will take you to their resource page there. So as we kind of wrap up, I'd like to leave with a thought from Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold was a pioneer in the idea of conservation, probably best known for writing a book called A Sand County Almanac. And in that book, he wrote that there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. Like winds and sunset, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. Now we face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in natural things, wild and free. For us of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and the chance to find a pasque flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. So, if wildlife is something you enjoy watching, if wildlife is something you have in your backyard or in your neighborhood, consider wildscape gardening. Doesn't have to be just ugly brush piles and snags. You can certainly incorporate those native plant species to create a beautiful, inviting wildscape garden, beautiful and inviting not only for wildlife, but beautiful and inviting and aesthetically pleasing to the human eye as well.